So the first one we'll talk about is construct validity. So what is validity? Validity basically is to make sure that your experiment and your constructs are set out to test what it wants to test. If this is a test that measures intelligence, it better measure intelligence and not measuring something else that's similar. If it's measuring your height, it should go out and measure your height, right? So for example, if I'm interested in your weight, interested in your height, and I take your weight, then that's not a very good measurement of your height. So even though it's a reliable measure, every time I take your weight it's the same, it's not a very valid measure because it doesn't really tell you how tall you are. So the first thing we talk about is construct validity, and it's basically how well do the things that you're trying to measure actually map onto the construct. What a construct is basically a kind of abstract psychological idea. We talked about aggression, something like attractiveness, intelligence, what else? Prejudice, discrimination, love, anything that's kind of invisible to measure is a construct. How do you take something abstract and put it in a lab that you can measure is the task of the experiment. So let's see what else we have. So construct validity basically is whether you defined your, you operationalize the way in your study a good way to measure your construct. So if you're interested in love, how do you measure love? If you're interested in how much two people love each other, what are some ways you can measure love? Right? So if you could measure it in the correct way, that's kind of construct validity. So for example, you might say, well, one way to measure love is how much two people spend time with each other, for example. That's a good one, right? So sometimes it has construct validity, but if you have to think about it, you say, well, maybe like roommates live together and they spend a lot of time together. Doesn't mean they're in love. Or coworkers spend a lot of time together. So that kind of measure lacks construct validity if there's kind of holes in it. So what are good ways of measuring love? Things like eye contact, how much you stare into each other's eyes, maybe kissing, maybe how long they've been married or how long they've been together, all kind of measures of love. So those are something that has construct validity. Let's look at some other kind of validity. There's the content validity, and that's the idea that what you're measuring the whole aspect of the whole spectrum of things that you're interested in measuring. So if you're interested in, say, aggression, you have to make sure you measure a whole host of concepts that are related to aggression and not just very specific ones. So if you're interested in aggression and you only measure, for example, how often someone punches someone else in the face, now that's a very specific manifestation of aggression. It doesn't occur a lot, right? No, not, you know, where do we live that we get in so many fistfights? So you want to make sure that when there's content validity, it means that you measure the entire content of that construct. The other one is face validity, which is basically face validity is just by looking how you measure it at the face of it, just by looking at it, whether it intuitively makes sense that it's what you measure. Basically, it's like a grandma test. If you bring it to your grandma says, oh, well, obviously that's what it studies, right? So if you're interested in love, and you measure hand-holding activity, that has face validity because only lovers kind of hold each other's hands. It might not be true in a culture where hand-holding is more common between friends or girls or whatnot. And so face validity is just by looking at the face of how you want to measure something, whether it's intuitively sensical. Now, certain things have low face validity but high actual construct validity. So for example, when we talk about love, things like pupil dilation and then also the galvanic skin response, which is basically how much you're sweating, is actually a measure of how much you like someone. If you're around someone you like a lot more, then your pupils dilate and then you become a little sweaty. And so that has no face validity because if you tell your grandma that, your grandma's like, well, what does sweating have to do with love, right? So you can see to make sure that these things aren't always go together. The next one is there's two criterion-related validity. Basically, whether what you've chosen fits the criterion of what you want to measure. And there's two kinds, concurrent validity and predictive validity. Concurrent validity is basically a study of whether it's a good measurement of right now, how much of that skill or measurement you have. So it could be like how well of a cook you are right now. That's a concurrent validity. On the other side is predictive validity, whether something can predict in the future what it is your skills might become. So for example, if I have a test that tests how well you could be a cook in the future, that's a predictive validity test. So again, whether your test measures your abilities now or your abilities later also has a kind of validity.